So our first two panels this morning focused on the bigger picture, macroeconomics and finance. Now we're going to drill down to the human level, where change has in fact been the greatest and most visible in Cuba so far. As we've already heard, official numbers place the number of Cuentapropistas, or self-employed, at about 500,000. However, my own calculations, if you add in private farmers, non-authorized informal sector, gray area firms, as well as moonlighting, that is to say, people who during the day work in state-owned enterprises, in the evenings and on the weekends work also in the private sector, 1 foot in each. You could have as many, in fact, as many as 2 million Cubans, 40% of the active labor force, working at least 1 foot already in the private sector. That's a much more potent and larger force than is commonly recognized in the official statistics and conversations. These self-employed firms were the first out of the gate. They have changed the face of Havana and other major urban centers. Many of them are industrious, they're courageous, and they've captured the imagination also of the international media. Now, here's one of the big questions for this panel now. Are these imaginative small-scale enterprises the cutting edge of economic transformation? Are they building momentum, creating new constituencies toward an inevitable march toward a more market-oriented socialism? Or are these small-scale businesses merely a safety valve, sopping up unemployment and providing some better consumer services, but all within the traditional framework of a centralized state socialism? That's one of the big questions we'll discuss on this panel. As Ted Henken has already pointed out, and will point out, the number of Cuentapropistas seems to have plateaued at around 500,000. What are the big obstacles to their further expansion? Can the new Obama offers on the table in expanding tourism, remittances, trade with the private sector, which is on the table, not yet picked up, can that new Obama offer stimulate a second surge and ignite a new stage in private sector expansion? John McIntyre on the panel will give us some inspiring stories about very recent innovations in cross-straits ITC services. Then we also have non-agricultural co-ops that have been slow to take off, but now the government seems committed to shedding at least the many government restaurants and other petty services and transforming them into worker-managed cooperatives. Can these new cooperatives become a major pillar of the new Cuban economy? And will these cooperatives be truly independent entities? We're lucky to have with us, as our lead speaker now, Rafael Betancourt, who will go into this. So now, without further ado, let me quickly introduce our three panelists. You have their bios. All of them have deep roots in Cuba. Rafael Betancourt, an economics degree from the University of Florida, now a professor at the University of Havana. He has decades of experience in international development and project management. He's currently with Havanada Consulting. Rafael is a leading authority on this new field of non-state cooperatives in Cuba. He'll be followed by Ted Henken, a sociologist at Baruch College. With impressive foresight, Ted wrote his dissertation a decade ago on this very topic of micro-enterprises in Cuba. He remains a foremost authority on the subject. He recently published, with Arch Ritter from the earlier panel, the book Entrepreneurial Cuba, The Changing Policy Landscape. And Ted maintains the popular blog El Yuma. And then finally, John McIntyre, who was born in Cuba, retired in 2004 from a successful career in investment banking. He's now an early-stage investor in education technology. John is a co-founder of Cuba Emprende, the largest entrepreneur training program and small-scale business incubator in Cuba. They'll speak in that order. Rafael.
How do I get this going? This way? Can somebody give me some help here? Okay, we got it. Good morning. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Brookings Institute, for inviting me. My first 3 or 4 slides are about the statistics, basically, of the non-state sector compared to the state sector, so I hope you can distribute those minutes and charge them for it too, because they're going to make use of it. Okay, basically, the employment in the state and non-state sector has actually, you can see the figure there, the employment in the state sector has decreased somewhat in these last 5 years. And the state sector, the employment in the other state sector, because other private are mostly farmers, so small farmers, together with the Cuentapropistas, or the actually people who have licenses to practice an activity that is legally allowable to be done privately. These are the figures that we're picking up here. And the cooperativistas, the number of members of cooperatives, which do not include the small farmers that are in CCS or in the Cooperativas de Crédito y Servicio, which are the ones that group private farmers and provide credit and services, has basically leveled. If we look at the new cooperatives, we see, or we look at the percentage of women. It's a very interesting thing that the state enterprises have 45% of the employment are women. But as you go down to the private sector, you have a significant reduction in the number of women, particularly in the farmers and the private license holders. And in cooperative, you have 14% in the agricultural and 22% in the non-agricultural. These women, these young women, are both students of mine. They have a small stained glass window cooperative in Old Havana. As we can see, in terms of the number of economic units, the number of cooperatives has actually declined from over 6,000 to around 5,000, 5,500 in the last few years, because there's been a consolidation of cooperatives, and some have actually failed to maintain their effectiveness or productivity, and they have been converted into or turned over as leased land to small farmers. The number of enterprises has also declined, but incredibly, as we were mentioning today, as Saida was saying, and Yaima, there has not been a reduction in the public enterprises, the public administered enterprises, which would be the budgeted, unidades presupuestadas, or the budgeted sector. So we hear a lot, but the number of budgeted units has remained relatively the same. If we look at the cooperatives themselves, the farmers and workers cooperatives, there has been basically relatively stability in the ones, the CCS, which are the ones that group private farmers, and the CPAs and the UBPCs have actually declined a little bit. And so in the statistics show for the first time the number of cooperatives in 2013 that are non-agricultural. So this is the first time it appears in the statistics. So focusing on the non-agricultural cooperatives, I don't like to use a negative term. It just seems that you don't characterize something, but what it is not. Omar Releni likes to call them urban cooperatives. I'm hoping that some of these will also be in rural areas someday. So I call them service and manufacturing cooperatives. There have been 498 approved a year ago. And I don't know if the new statement that Juan was referring to speaks about a new group. We've been waiting for a new group to be announced, but it hasn't been yet. So we're about a year into a process that has no new set of cooperatives approved. And of these, 329 are operational. A third of those are retail markets, farmers markets, basically, that have been turned over from the state to the workers. They're in other activities as well. 53% are in Havana, and some are the other two provinces that have the most are Artemisa and Matanzas. By the way, I'm with Matanzas baseball team, not Havana. Just to make a note here. Sorry. Sorry for you. So, but the important thing is that there's a concentration. I was teaching last year in Guantanamo, and I could barely see the presence of the private sector or cooperative or the urban cooperatives. I think there's one in Guantanamo. So again, the point that there's Havana and then that it's not Cuba is a very important point to make. 77% are former state-owned enterprises that have been turned over to its workers, and only 23% are grassroots initiatives. And that has a lot to do with the fact that you can only form a cooperative based on the 201 activities that are approved. And those activities are practically only 3 that are professional. Translator, interpreter. I have a license as a translator interpreter, Juan. You should try to get that. That's good. I'm a self-employed licensed TCP. There is one for carrying out accounting services, and the third one, which I don't remember. Those are the other 3. So you have a limit there, a cap. There are over 500 applications that are pending. The service and manufacturing co-ops, I just put some photographs here. And the last one is the cooperative of ornithologists. They're the only ones that are allowed to export. They haven't done too well, but they are the only ones. So we have a precedent. There is one cooperative that is allowed to export. So we're expecting another, the announcement was made of another 13,000 new small and medium-sized enterprises by 2017, all coming from MINSIN, from the Ministry of Internal Trade or Domestic Trade. They will basically split off about 9,000 into cooperatives, and the smaller ones that have 4 or less workers into basically units with private workers that lease the facilities from the state. And I just wanted to note a few, just some achievements of these cooperatives in the short period that they have been working. One is that many of these are, the government itself is admitting to these achievements, and more and better services and products, and a very real public acceptance. The people are really, in Cuba, are really optimistic for the cooperatives. There's a sense of belonging and ownership that its members are developing. They have definitely achieved higher incomes, sometimes 3-4 times the previous income. And they have established commercial relations with agricultural cooperatives and private workers, whereas they've had a lot more difficult time in establishing commercial relations with state suppliers. The grassroots non-agricultural cooperatives have shown more capability, more ability in legal issues, accounting, marketing, and management. Problems, just very, very quickly go over them. The question of inputs, the provisions for these, this is their first and major complaint. Every time you speak to a non-agricultural cooperative, they complain about this. The lack of a wholesale market, the lack of planning of, they're not included in the state plans. So therefore that there's not a particular amount of goods that are destined for them. They have to compete with the state enterprises. There is variable support by the relevant ministry. They're always connected to a ministry. Some ministries, like transportation, have provided a lot of support, others very little. There is a very uncertainty about the future of their capital goods, which right now belong to the state, but they are basically paying them through the maintenance and so on. So at some point, for example, the buses to the urban bus cooperative, they are basically going to pay for them in the next 2 years. And what's going to happen? Are they still going to continue to be property of the state, of the enterprise that they broke off from? The rents are inflexible. For example, the Cooperativa La Casona, the restaurant across from Foxa, it's a huge building, and they're paying on basically on square meters, and so they're paying 4,000 CUCs a month just in rent, and so there is this inflexibility of adjusting to the particular conditions of each. The centralized approval process is horrible at this point. Any new cooperative has to be approved by the Council of Ministers after receiving the approval of the corresponding ministry. Sometimes it just gets stuck there because there are some ministries that are not approving and therefore thus elevating to a higher level the proposal. the lack of training programs and business services, and the question of financing, which we already addressed and I don't want to get into. Constraints that exist. The grassroots cooperatives, I spoke about that already, only can come from allowable TCP activities, and the 201 allowable activities have not changed in over 2 years, and there's this thing of what's going to happen with the professionals. The access to external markets and investment capital is a constraint. The double currency and the multiple exchange rate, which affects the state sector more than the private and the cooperative sector. The lack of second and third tier cooperatives, the lack of cooperative federations, except for ANAP, which is basically a federation of the agricultural cooperatives, and it works both as a federation as an institute. It has this mixed function of representing the state and also representing the cooperatives. The lack of a cooperative institute, it makes this difficult because whoever represents the cooperatives is also representing the state. There is a lack of enabling legislation and public policies. To begin with, non-agricultural cooperatives are not allowed in the Cuban Constitution. So that's just the beginning. And there is really a need for networking, for cooperative movement worldwide that can be an ally to this process. And this is the report of the National Cooperative Business Association after its trip to Cuba last July. And now they have formed formally the Cuba Cooperative Working Group, and they are really moving forward this agenda here. And so the new cooperatives in Cuba's economic strategy. I think to begin with, there are definitely TCP limitations. I'm sure Ted's going to talk about this, to operate and to grow. But there's also a bias in favor of this Horatio Alger story, right? That these private workers are the heroic individuals who are going to create successful business and bring us into the future. In fact, I think that the new cooperatives are a lot closer to those elements that will be part of Cuba's emerging small and medium enterprise system. Because to begin with, the basic tenet is this phrase, socialism is social property of the fundamental means of production. And cooperatives, while in the United States there's a debate whether they're private or public, in Cuba it's clearly a social form of property. And you can expect a lot more induced non-agricultural cooperatives as Cuba trims its very big and heavy public sector, public administration sector. And you really don't have a choice. When you release thousands of units from the state sector, you can only do two things. You can sell it to the highest bidder, or you could turn it over to its workers. Well, sell it to the highest bidder, and that's what happened in Eastern Europe. That's the experience there. You're just basically converting this whole sector into a capitalist sector, and that's not the intention of the country. And finally, there's pressure from below to expand the grassroots cooperatives, which will make a difference. Finally, can Cuba's co-ops become an element of sustainable development? I think so. And I think it can be really part of a social and solidarity economy in which the state sector and the private sector and the public administration all have its roles. But definitely, as we move into a diversification of our property and management matrix, a cooperative is definitely going to be a major player in this. Thank you very much.
All right, while they're getting my slides up here, let me thank Ted Picone for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with so many colleagues from recent vintage and from vintage from the 90s, from when I did some of my research in Cuba. I wanted to also thank Wayne Smith, who's here. When I was a graduate student at Tulane University many moons ago, he gave me some of the seed money from Johns Hopkins, where I first went to Cuba to start some of the research. This was in 1999, I think. So thank you for that. In our book that Arch Ritter and I wrote together, Entrepreneurial Cuba, we do have a chapter on cooperatives, but your presentation is a bit more fresh in terms of the things that are happening right now. I learned a lot. And some of what you said, as you did say, will help us, will kind of serve as background for my presentation, especially in terms of opportunities within Cuba, but also the obstacles within Cuba. So I won't repeat, but I may just nod in your direction to say, footnote, Rafael. What I'd like to do, I guess, is someone helping to get my slides up when that comes up. What I'm going to do, and I rarely do this, but as a kind of a way of introducing the topic and also extending my thanks to a couple people, I want to read the opening page of our book, a paragraph from the opening page. Prior to 2010, serious study of this sector, the sector of self-employment or micro-enterprise, was taboo because state policies had consistently stigmatized it as illegitimate and banished it to the shadows. The title of the dissertation that Richard mentioned was Condemned to Informality. Even since 2010, small private enterprise has been relatively underanalyzed within Cuba, a trend partly remedied by the important work of Omar Eberleni Perez Villanueva and Pavel Vidal Alejandro, as well as Juan Triana. So it's also an honor to be here sharing the panels and the room with two of those three economists who've done pioneering work from within Cuba on this same sector. Elsewhere, the earliest and most rigorous work on this subject is easily that of Cuban-American economist Jorge Perez Lopez, who in fact was also here this morning. He wrote a book in 1995, 20 years ago, and that book was titled Cuba's Second Economy, From Behind the Scenes to Center Stage. He was being optimistic back in 1995. That book set a high bar for those who might follow him. In the 10 years between 95 and 2005, however, public policy became increasingly antagonistic toward microenterprise and pushed self-employment, known as trabajo por cuenta propia in Cuba, back behind the scenes once again. And it was essentially eviscerated or extinct by 2005. But then the events that have unfolded since 2006, both in Cuba and the United States, have changed things. I also wanted to give a shout out to Joe Scarpacci, Richard Feinberg, and Phil Peters. Their work has been an exemplary model for its rich ethnographic reportage and its original dispassionate analysis of Cuba's now reemerging private sector. So I guess they're working on my slides here. So what I'll do is I'll just dive right in. The title of my talk today is Enterprise in Cuba, Citizen Empowerment, State Abandonment, or U.S. Business Opportunity. And I use those three terms because there's a kind of a question mark as to what's happening here, and Richard referred to this at the beginning. Is the Cuban government brushing the crumbs of the economy off the table so that the Cuban people can live off of them, or is it really partnering with or unleashing the power and the potential of Cuban entrepreneurs? And that question, I think, is still open because if you look at those 201 private sector occupations, which are the same occupations as Rafael mentioned that you can do as a cooperative, there are a handful, and I'll refer to some of those in a second, and John will present on one of those handful, that are truly innovative, modern. We heard before about competitiveness and technology from one of the earlier speakers. Those fit the bill, but the vast majority are survival. So is the state just abandoning people to their own fate? Remember this could be seen as economic freedom, but it also could be state abandonment. That's why I use the term state abandonment. Remember, trabajo por cuenta propia could be translated as on your own-ism. You are on your own, good luck, right? So, any luck with getting my slides running? Maybe I'd have to open it up here. No. Hello, is anyone out there? Well, let me start with this then, and maybe someone will come and show the bells and the whistles of the presentation. 1 minute, okay, great. When Arch and I did the research over the last 15 years for this book, we often heard two expressions from Cuban entrepreneurs that tried to tell us their situation, their struggles, and kind of their philosophy. The first expression was, el ojo del amo engorda el caballo. Thank you. We should go on the road here, right? And the second expression is, el que tenga tienda, y si no, muy bien, okay. So if you need the translation, the eye of the owner fattens the horse, and whoever has a store should tend to the store, and if not, then sell the damn thing, right? And so this is the popular wisdom that we heard from Cuban entrepreneurs who've essentially said, you know, hey, I'm trying to run a business, and I know as closer I am to the horse of the business is going to get fat. But if the business is kind of run by a bunch of people who don't really have incentives, then that horse may end up skinny. Rafael Hernandez, the other Rafael, said to me many years ago when I was a student at Tulane University, kind of trying to describe the Cuban economy and the system of incentives, he said, well, in Cuba we have this kind of bizarre system where we pretend to work and the government pretends to pay us. And so that's another way of capturing this same dilemma about the skinny horse and the fat horse, who will appear on your screen any second. But basically, the picture that I have up, or had up, the skinny horse is eating grass. The fat horse is running. And so it's not just the fact of, you know, what happens to the horse, but what the horse does. How then can you incentivize productivity, activity, versus just mere elements or activities that are centered around survival? And if you review the 201 occupations, Richard, in a white paper he wrote at Brookings a year and a half ago, has the list. We also have the list in our book. You'll see that a number of them, actually a lot of them, are medieval in their orientation and about survival. Raúl's reforms. Raúl's reforms are centered around the a kind of a dilemma, or a balance maybe, between ambition, prisa, and caution, pausa. Okay, great. So here's our horse, or our horses. Okay, and you see the active and the passive, the fat and the skinny.
That's a pregnant horse. Well, that's good too.
Hey, we're growing the population. That's, you know, more mouths to feed, more economic activity, right? I'm the proud father of an 8-month-old son, so don't be down on pregnancy, all right? So here's kind of a hit list of my favorite kind of warring expressions or phrases in Cuba today. Prisa and pausa that I already mentioned. The one that I want to focus most of my attention on is one that was brought to my attention by Tomás Bilbao and Carlos Rodriguez of the Cuba Study Group. Last year, we partnered with them at the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, and we hosted 5 female entrepreneurs to speak and tell us about their struggles and experiences. And when I was setting up the program, I said, so, dime los nombres de estas cuentapropistas. Tell me the names of these self-employed workers. And Tomás shot back at me very quickly. Well, first of all, they do not want to be identified or introduced as cuentapropistas. They are, and they call themselves, emprendedoras. Why? Because cuentapropista is an idea of survival. It's a government kind of control and limited framework definition, whereas entrepreneur or emprendedora highlights ingenuity, resourcefulness, and market savvy, and that is what they were about. Granted, there are many people in the Cuban economy who are on their own and surviving, but these 5 women are clearly see themselves as something different and wanted to be presented and understood that way. A couple other words that are kind of between how we frame this series of reforms or updating, and those are indicative of this kind of balance between ambition and caution. We've already seen these numbers, so this kind of points to the plateauing effect of a big jump in 2010, and then slow growth in the numbers of self-employed workers over the past 3 years. This number is a little higher if you add 2014 and the very beginnings of 2015. We're still just shy of 500,000 workers. Remember, 20% of those workers, roughly 100,000 people, are actually people who work for other businesses. They have licenses, basically the same license, but their license is as a contractor or an employee of a business that's run by someone else. So that doesn't mean that there are 500,000 legal entrepreneurs. There's about 400,000, and 100,000 work for them. But the phraseology at the bottom is very important, and this is from the top down. Raul has sent the message repeatedly of a need to change he includes himself in this mentality. He uses the word at the bottom, quite a few of us have these biases. We need to facilitate and end the stigma and prejudice and even the demonization. I really think that he was talking obliquely about his big brother, because his big brother was the one who was largely leading the way in the ideological stigmatization of that kind of mal necesario back in the 1990s. Here is just a balance sheet of some of the steps forward, qualitative changes and some quantitative changes in self-employment. Licenses are easy to get now. They used to be a bureaucratic nightmare. They're issued pretty quickly. There's a wider array going from about 170 to now 201 occupations. It's still a number, it's still limited, but it's grown. Tax policy is better, especially if you use lots of inputs. You need, have value added, especially the restaurants. They can deduct a greater percentage of their expenses before paying their taxes. And since 1968, the first time Cubans can actually employ, private sector employ other Cubans. So those are all, I would say, qualitative steps forward and quantitative steps forward, but I would say that the onerous and frustrating obstacles still blocking greater development. We've heard about some of these before. I mentioned the fact that many of these things are not entrepreneurial, they're more medieval and survival-oriented. Just a quick quote from Julia Cook, who published an article in the New York Times about a year ago. She said, "A Cuban can go into business as a party clown, but not a lawyer." Sorry to the lawyers in the audience. "She can open up a bar, but not a private clinic." Sorry to the doctors in the audience. So here we have a clear division between service, kind of crumb-oriented activity, the crumbs off the table, versus productive and innovative activity. We will hear a little bit more about those when we hear from John. And then there's the list. The list could have been a negative list. It's a positive list, but a positive list is actually a negative thing because it tells people only what they can do. It doesn't leave it open to them. Okay? Now we have Obama, and I'll close, given that I have the 2 minutes, this should be just right, I'll close with the pivot of Obama. And on this slide, I simply wanted to highlight the element of the pivot, which I describe as a shift, moving from a failed policy of trying to destabilize Cuba and its government through isolating and impoverishing it and its people. The new policy is exactly the shift, is the opposite, is a 180-degree shift, although the administration doesn't have total control over our policy, thanks to Helms-Burton. Empowerment through engagement and making Cubans more prosperous. There's really a two-track thing going on here. Now, those of you who studied Cuba in the 90s will probably remember track 2. This is very different from track 2, right? This is the two-track policy of reaching out to the Cuban people, the POC, and also engaging with the Cuban government, the GOC. If you remember Obama's first words in his speech on December 17th, "Today, the United States is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba." That phrase was not an accident. So the idea is to reach out and empower individual entrepreneurs. But there's a sticking point here in the discussions between Vidal and Jacobson. Obviously, we don't have an embassy open yet because it's very technically difficult, but also the United States wants to engage the Cuban people in certain ways that the Cuban government is not comfortable with. But still, they're engaging on a two-track system here with the Cuban government trying to reestablish relations with it in order to incentivize the government to deepen its reforms. There's a question about regime change lurking in the background. Obama clearly stated at the Summit of the Americas that the United States is not in the business of regime change. Well, there's people in Congress who seem to disagree with Obama, and that's still the law of the land as frozen in Helms-Burton. So my advice to the U.S. Policymakers in this is eschew any Trojan horse approach to entrepreneurial engagement that seeks to empower the Cuban people by undermining the Cuban government. My last slide here brings us to a win-win-win-win situation, and this is the situation of Airbnb. I'm holding in my hand there, I took a picture of it, of the full-page ad that canvassed many newspapers in the United States on, I think it was April 3rd or so, it's the Sunday newspaper. And this ad says, "One giant leap for man's kindness. The doors to 1,000 real Cuban homes are now open to you." I highlight this just as a quick way of saying, what did the new Obama pivot specifically allow and provide in terms of support for entrepreneurship in Cuba? Airbnb is the best case example because Obama's pivot legalized purchasing services from the private sector in Cuba. But how do you purchase a service from a private sector in Cuba if you're in the United States? Well, Cubans have 20 years of experience with B&B, but do they have the air? They're getting the air very slowly with the slow internet connections that they have and the expensive ones, but the Airbnb engaged Cuban government, the US government, and Cuban entrepreneurs to make this system work. They develop a workaround, so it's a win for the entrepreneur, more money directly into their pockets. It's a win for the US consumer who can stay in a private home in Cuba. Authentic experience, a real Cuban home, as the slogan of the ad says. But also the Cuban government needs now to collaborate. There's an incentive for it to collaborate with the private sector because they're swamped by tourists. They don't have enough rooms. And this is, they're actually legalizing and permitting tour groups to come through to contract out and work together with paladares, with bed and breakfasts, and other people. So this is kind of an element that highlights some of the potential, and we'll hear more about that potential coming to its fruition in one example from John McIntyre. Thank you very much.
Well, I am going to pick up on some of the points that both Rafael and Ted mentioned on professional services as well as cooperatives. But first, again, let me thank Brookings, Richard, Ted, et cetera, for this opportunity. And then I'm going to dive into one particular field of activity, one license, which is, I think, the one you were trying to come up with, which is computer programming. That's right. So first, though, just on the big picture, again, you've heard a little bit about this, but I'll try to put it in some context. Back to the list of 201 licenses that are available. You can say there's 3 or 5 or 8, but there's less than 10 which are professional services. And put that in the context of a highly educated, highly trained society and the amount of investment in human capital that the Cuban state has put into it, it's just a very strange situation. And just to put this in a little bit of context, and I'm not going to take this comparison too far, but Israel is a state of 7 million people versus Cuba's 11. And if you look at the education, literacy, and health indicators of Israel versus Cuba, they're identical. They are identical in terms of years of schooling, literacy, everything. And obviously Israel, which is a unique case, and again, I'm not going to take the comparison too far, but just to state the fact that Israel's economy is 10 times the size of Cuba's, and they lead with technology, with biotech, with pharmaceuticals, et cetera, all things which actually Cuba is pretty good at. But right now it's restricted in its growth to what's being done in the state sector, and obviously the government is restricted in terms of resources, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, just to make that general point. So back to the professional services, the less than 10, 3 I think are exportable, being accounting services. And of course, accountants in Cuba don't work with international accounting standards, so that's something that's probably not going to be a big issue or a big source of activity in the near term. I think long term it will be. Photography is a niche business. So you come down to number 103 on the list of 201. You have it as 104, but I have the original list. It's 103. See, I knew he was going to look, which is computer programming. So it's legal in Cuba. It's exportable to the U.S. under the new rules as a service. There's huge demand, both in the U.S. and elsewhere. And guess what? The Cubans are world class at it. They are, from an early age, those that score high in math are tracked to certain schools, the Escuela Tecnológicas, for 10th, 11th, 12th grades. Then they go to UCI, which is a world-class institution, and other forms of training. And I'm told that there's actually a high percentage of actual programmers, of coders, versus other computer science fields like network engineers, system engineers, et cetera, because that infrastructure isn't big in Cuba. So a disproportionate number of those who are steered through this track end up as coders. So you're a coder now in Cuba, and you're looking at potentially great opportunities. Or what are your options in terms of being employed and and having a fulfilling work experience? I mean, obviously, many are in the public sector, working at state companies. UCI contracts a number of them to work on very important projects. And what's the big advantage of being in that situation is, in addition to a decent wage, which actually the wages are going up for programmers in the public sector. I mean, they're paying as much as 90, 100 Coops a month now, which is quite a bit higher than other comparable professions. But you have access to the internet, right, to do both the job you're supposed to be doing and potentially other jobs. But you have steady access to the internet in most cases, which is a very big deal. So you take a chance and leave the state sector and get your Cuentapropistas license to be a computer programmer. You may earn more money. Certainly some are earning significantly more than the number I just mentioned. But the question is, what is your access to the internet? I mean, Cubans have gotten very, very good at working offline. I know programmers, through Cuba Emprende, about 5% of our graduates are programmers. We know some that are already working for companies in Miami. And what they do, well, they do various things, but most of their work is done offline, and either then it's downloaded to a hard drive or a flash drive and transported to where it needs to go, or they have an Ictexa landline, and they're using a dial-up modem, which they don't use it all day. They get what they need to do in the morning, download it, they work all day offline, and then they push it back, through a modem back to Miami or wherever else. But still, it's fraught with that risk in terms of losing your access. And also, the Cuentapropistas license for computer programmers is actually one of the worst from a taxation point of view. I think you can only deduct 10% of your costs. It's at the bottom of the list of that. And of course, it faces all the other same challenges that other license holders has, which scaling is very difficult. More than 5 employees, the labor taxes kick in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there are some decent-sized companies, but it's an awkward situation where you have 1 or 2 licenses and the contractors and so on. So less than ideal. So what could be done? I mean, what's a favorable scenario for the outlook? I mean, this is where I get to the cooperative situation. And a general comment on professional service cooperatives. I'm only aware of one. And Rafael, please correct me, but there's a consultancy that, in fact, helps other cooperatives get started.
There's 4 now.
There's 4?
And 2 functioning.
Okay, 2 functioning, okay. But still, it gets back to the same point. All these educated people who only have a couple of licenses that they can to take advantage of. And programming would be, I think, adapt itself very well to cooperative structure. But the question is, will the approvals be forthcoming to allow this to happen? I was encouraged. I didn't know about the announcements yesterday. I think Omar referenced, I'm not sure, or maybe Juan, about being able to contract outside labor now for 12 months and the tax holiday going on 6 months. I mean, that's all great that they're continuing to tinker with the cooperative structure. But this, I think, is going to be key for an ecosystem to develop, and that Cuba can take its place, as it should, I think, in among societies which can actually harness the talent that and the investment that's been put into its people. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
3 terrific presentations, all very complimentary. Ted, how much time do we have for this panel now? We started a little bit late, but we started a little bit late, so maybe we'll grab a few extra minutes. But we are running up against the lunch time. Let me throw the first question on the table, then we'll open it up. So the Cuban government has been saying they want the embargo lifted. They want the embargo lifted, but President Obama put on the table a major opening from the embargo, in which he said U.S. companies could import and export with the non-state sector, that is to say with cooperatives and with the Cuentapropistas. Yet, to my knowledge, with maybe 1 or 2 small exceptions of the sorts that have been mentioned here, that process, announced at the beginning of this year, has not yet opened up. And we've talked about all the constraints on co-ops and private sector, one major one of which was inputs. And that's precisely the offer that's on the table. Buy from U.S. firms. What are the obstacles that need to be removed in order for Cuba, for the Cuentapropistas, for the co-ops, to take advantage of the Obama offer that's on the table?
Why don't you start it then?
the state holds a very rigid monopoly over the foreign sector in general. So imports, exports, financing is totally controlled, and there seems to be no tendency right now to decentralize access to this. So this is a major obstacle from the Cuban side. There is no, I haven't heard that there is any movement in that direction. It could be also, there could be movement as a result of some advancement in the normalization of relations with Cuba, with the United States. But right now, that is a major obstacle. In the sector that you're talking about, I know for a fact that the Minister of Communications has a stack of applications to form cooperatives in the information sector. And the problem is that when you export those services, either internally to foreign or joint ventures or externally to a foreign client, you are basically breaking that monopoly. And that, I think, this is what's holding it back. Now the new announcements, they will be able to sell or purchase those products within Cuba. So a state enterprise or a joint venture could do it. But at this point, I think that's one of the biggest obstacles.
Any other comments on that?
I mean, Rafael really captured it. I call that the autobloqueo. Sometimes it's referred to that as the internal restrictions. There was a really instructive case in late 2013 of the Cuban government cracking down on some of the creative interpretations that some of the Cuentapropistas had made of their licenses. So people who had licenses to be seamstresses and tailors were actually importing through mules from Ecuador and Miami clothing, and then setting up all across the island of Cuba little boutiques on every street corner in the portales of Cuba, and they were reselling that imported clothing. That clothing was of better quality, it was more variety, it was better price than the monopoly retail that the Cuban government has, and the Cuban government didn't like that. And so instead of trying to figure out how can we recognize this so it provides goods and services at a good price, at a good quality, and a good variety, it closed them all down. Now, it closed them all down. It said, like in September or October, hey, this is not in your license, that you're being a little bit too creative, and it gave them until December to liquidate their goods. But I've heard that what they've done essentially is that now they just use catalogs, and so they still do this. They still pay off people at the customs, and they just circulate catalogs, and then people can buy the clothing that way. The same thing happened with a very inventive interpretation of a license for children's entertainment. People set up 3D movie theaters in their homes. This was very successful, and the Cuban government said this is not included in your license, and they closed down all of the showings of Avatar in Cuba. I'm sure they still survive in one way or another. So this is a big issue, and this brings us back to, I think, the issue of political will that was raised before.
Thanks. My own view, by the way, is that the executive branch could undertake a second round of economic liberalization, but I don't see them doing that until what they've already proposed, what's already on the table, actually goes into effect. So we need to see to what extent the offer that's already on the table is permitted in the Cuban context before I think you'd likely to see a second round of carving away exceptions to the embargo. All right, we have time for, why don't we do this, Ted, since we've got a tight time constraint. I'll take 3 or 4 questions at once, and then the panel can respond to those questions that they find most interesting as a way to wrap it up. Let's see how far back we can go. Who's the farthest back there? The woman here on the, yes, you please. Could you stand up and identify yourself?
And my question is, thank you. My question is, to what extent is brain drain a challenge for Cuba's economic development? I believe, in the 90s and maybe after that, it was seen as, there was a lot of flight of talent. But now I'm told by Cubans and others that some are returning, whether to open businesses or to invest or to engage in other activities. Well, I have other questions, but I'll leave it at that.
That's great. Okay.
Thank you.
Do I see the hand of a leading Cuban scholar to whom we all must bend down and recognize his long-standing expertise as well as a high moral character. Phil Brenner.
Where is he?
Right here.
So Ted Henken alluded, Philip Renner, American University. Ted Henken alluded to one of the issues that faces the Cuban government and leads to a paradox, and that is corruption. One of the reasons for clamping down on some of these private dealings is to avoid corruption, yet it paradoxically opens up the possibility for corruption. Can you speak to the problem of corruption? Is there evidence that the way in which the Cuban system is now operating with cooperatives is leading to payoffs so that people can get licenses, so that they can skirt the system?
Okay, one or two more questions about the two hands in the back, and that'll be our 4 questions. Please identify yourselves.
Yes, yes, Frank Fletcher, Daniel Morgan Academy. In terms of the housing situation, it was mentioned previously that about 4 million houses needed to be rehabilitated. I don't see that solution coming from foreign investment. I can't see, given the minimal Cuban income, that anyone would want to or could own apartment buildings or things. The ability of people to pay rent is just not there. But I don't know what could be done in that regard, but it's a tremendous problem. Rehabilitation of existing housing or the construction of new housing.
Okay, of course, if you travel around Cuba today, you will see already a lot of remodeling going on by the very owners themselves of the properties, very often with money that's come from abroad, that is to say remittances, which may simply be donations or may be under-the-table forms of investment.
Hi,
Yes.
Wendy Lures from
Thank you, Wendy.
the Foundation for Civil Society and Beyond Conflict. What role is the European Union and the Europeans playing?
Okay. All right, as for broad questions, you don't have to tackle every one of them, but maybe if each panelist would take 1 or 2 of those questions, then we'll wrap it up. Start with Rafael.
Okay, in terms of the brain drain, I think that after 2013, as was noted here, in in January, the immigration law was passed, and it allows Cubans to stay abroad for a 2-year period, after which they must return in order to renew their passport, but they do not lose their properties, they do not lose any of their benefits as Cuban residents. So now you have people that are actually residing in 2 places. They have residency abroad and they have residency in Cuba. This allows for this reversal of brain drain. I think that the Chinese and others have shown that the people that left in a certain period of time can return with greater skills and greater knowledge, and this becomes a possibility, and in some cases a reality, as in the case of people coming back from Spain with a small amount. 20,000 euros will not get you much very far in Spain, but that'll allow you to make a significant investment in Cuba. So I think that the brain drain can be reversed. Secondly, in terms of corruption, what we're seeing most is the evasion of taxes, as was mentioned here, and also obtaining supplies in the black market because of the huge limitations in the wholesale. But in terms of paying off people, there's probably some in terms of inspectors, health inspectors and people like that, but generally the licenses, as was mentioned here, are being issued rather expediently. And finally, in terms of housing, you're right, Richard, that the issue right now is the availability of building materials, which is, there's a lot of constraints in that, and that if there was a greater availability, there will be a lot more owners that are repairing their own homes.
Let me add really quickly to the question on brain drain. Sometimes this is referred to as el robo de cerebros, more kind of propagandistically, but there is a U.S. policy that tries to incentivize that for doctors. You could also call it brain waste, right? And if you don't give people opportunity, you're wasting that talent. And we've talked a lot about that kind of contradiction of training people really well, educating them for free, and then straitjacketing them. So that is an issue. I heard at LASA just a few days ago in Puerto Rico a great presentation by a political scientist, sociologist, Antonio Aja from Cuba, on the demographic transition and the problems that Cuba faces. Of course, they have an aging population, and they also have very high rates of immigration, people leaving the country. Although it is true, and he did point out, that Cuba's escape hatch has now become a revolving door. And that does mean that, you know, the future you can kind of bet on or depend on people going abroad and bringing back skill, know-how, and money to invest in businesses, et cetera. The issue of corruption, this is a very practical one, but also a kind of a theoretical one, in that it partly is a result of the institutional structure of opportunities and also constraints. If you're a Cuban entrepreneur or if you're a Cuban lawmaker, one philosophy is to make very strict laws and make lots of laws, and that's what they have done, but that really creates law evasion. So what really needs to happen is a kind of a reform so that there are fewer but well-enforced and logical, justifiable regulations. The last thing I'll mention is the import-export issue that wasn't really raised, but I think it's an important one. On the U.S. side, and this speaks to your question, Richard, I've heard a number of U.S. diplomats say very clearly that the United States would be open to sending or allowing the export of materials to Cuba, even through, if they were forced to use all import, a very, very appropriately named organization since they import everything, as long as they got certification that all import, the final customer was the private sector. So the United States government seems to be bending over backward to saying, we want to work with you, knocking on the door, but that monopoly on the foreign trade is a big one.
John?
Yeah, just on the same first two topics. I think I'll leave the other two to you, Richard. But no, just on the brain drain, I agree with the points that were made. I just go back to the fact that, you know, opportunity for, in the end, Cuba's going to be a service-based economy, and getting greater opportunities for trained, skilled people in the services is going to be key to keeping them there. They may be coming back, but the question is, are they just coming back, you know, not to work, and their primary business is offshore? They're just coming back to see family and to enjoy Cuba. So again, I go back to the point of scalable businesses, which, you know, cooperatives seem to be the solution to that. And broader licensing categories for professionals are going to be ultimately, I think, the key towards keeping a lot of, you know, the most highly trained people in Cuba. You know, on the corruption issue, just at the micro level, you know, and we see this with Cuba Emprende graduates. I mean, the risk of the system now is that the individual license holder faces a set of taxation rules that, if you know, if strictly speaking were abided by, most of them, you know, would be paying more in taxes than they're making. So, you know, there was a reference earlier to 60% underreporting. I'm surprised it's only 60%. I think it's probably higher. But so the taxation system then is perverse, and that you know, lends itself to selective enforcement, right? So you have, as tax collectors come around and try to look at the books of Cuentapropistas, it just puts a lot of you know, arbitrary authority in the hands of tax collectors, and that's just a very dangerous situation, you know, for all sides.
Okay, also on the corruption side, in addition to the points of burdensome rules that inevitably produce evasion, you have the two fundamental root causes of corruption in Cuba, I would say. One is extremely low wages, and the other is generalized lack of transparency. Those are your two fundamental root causes that need to be addressed over the long run, I would say. The other point on barriers to why the Obama offer has not yet, which would solve so many of the problems we've talked about in the cooperative and Cuentapropista sector. I think one missing piece of it is finance. Who might provide the finance? And what sort of financial trade credit guarantees might be available? And I think that's a piece that I would suggest the U.S. and the Cuban government put on the table for their future round of discussions. Finally, Wendy Lohr's question about the role of the EU, maybe just very briefly. First, of course, you have investments, direct investments from the European Union, many of them dating from the 1990s, and I expect you'll have another wave now with the new opportunities on the table. You also have the upcoming Paris Club discussions to deal with previous existing commercial debts, which need to be dealt with, and the Paris Club, which is mainly Europeans, have indicated they would be interested in focusing on. And then finally, as you know very well, the ongoing discussions about the common position and political and human rights issues that are part of that ongoing discussion. Then finally, of course, the EU as a group and then individual countries do have small, but in some cases very interesting bilateral foreign assistance programs, technical assistance programs in a range of areas. And that I think with the willingness of the Cuban government could be scaled up. And perhaps you could have co-financing with CAF and with others to take some of those interesting projects and take them to the next level. So with that, Ted, I think we can wrap up a very successful panel. Thank you all very much.